guys, it's Kwana back again with another review. This time I'm going to be reviewing Fear Street 1666, which I've just watched for like the third time, and I feel really dumb because I just got the connection. Sarah Fier, Fear Street. Boy, I'm slow. All right, so before we get started, I'm going to be breaking down a brief summary and my thoughts on the movie, whether I recommend it or not. And then I'm going to kind of go into my non-spoilery take, or my spoilery take. And I'll make sure that I put a timestamp for you guys if you haven't had a chance to see the movie yet, so that you can get my quick thoughts and reaction and then come back for all of the deeper dive thoughts that I have about this. All right. So Fear Street 1666 picks up as the third part of the Fear Street trilogy. And if you've already had an opportunity to either see the trailer or to watch the first two parts of this trilogy, it starts with Dina, who we meet as our protagonist in part 1, 1994, and she has entered the body of Sarah Fier, and we are transported in time with her to 1666, the beginnings of the curse that is on Shadyside, and when Shadyside and Sunnyvale were one community known as Union. We meet Sarah as this outcast, kind of tomboyish girl who's being raised by her father and with her brother Henry. And it's a particularly special night as the teenagers in the town are going to be going into the woods and celebrating and having a little party. Very much paying homage to Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and kind of paying homage in general to the Salem witch trials in that sequence. And we find out that someone has made a deal with the devil and is offering up people from the town in order to gain prosperity. That is the premise of part 1. This movie actually comes in 2 parts. So right after the first hour and 5 minutes, we get part 2, where we go back to 1994 with Dina, with her brother Josh, with Ziggy, as they try to stop the killer once and for all, to reclaim their lives and to save Dina's girlfriend Sam. I thought this movie was really, really good. It's not my favorite of the trilogy. I think my favorite is still 94, but I feel like that kind of changes on a day-to-day basis. I think this is really, really strong. The 1666 part 1 was really, really, really strong. There were some issues with some of the dialects that the actors, couldn't really commit to. But I like the narrative style of this. The choice to have Dina enter Sarah's body so that we're witnessing everything that happened firsthand, I think was a really interesting choice. I like that choice better than the way that part 2 told the story, just through Ziggy retelling the story to us. However, they make the choice to cast characters or actors from parts 1 and 2 into 1666 iterations of themselves. And on the one hand, I really like that choice. I thought that was a smart choice because it allows us to have those same connections, especially because we don't get to deeper dive into some of those characters. We don't really get to know much about some of them at all. And so it allows those feelings to transfer, the feelings that we had for them in part 1 and part 2 to transfer over to those characters. So we don't have to spend as much time getting to know them. And I think on the one hand, that really worked. On the other hand, just from a historical perspective, it doesn't work, especially because of 2 major plot points that we get in 1666, which is we meet Sarah Fier's father, which one would assume perhaps is a reincarnated version of Dina's father, except we never meet Dina's father. And I think the same thing goes for Sam's father. Sam is reincarnated into Hannah Miller, the daughter of Pastor Cyrus Miller. And because we meet them, it makes me wish that we had met those individuals in the 1994 version. So I thought that was an interesting stylistic choice, but overall, on the whole, it worked because it allowed me to care for some of the characters a little bit quicker. And this was a much darker film, especially part one, than the previous two films. It's going for more of the horror that's kind of like supernatural. Think of The Witch 2015. It's paying heavy homage to that. Think of some of the Conjuring type storylines where it's really heavily into like the elements of like witchcraft and like the satanic elements. And so in that regard, it's much darker than the previous two movies, definitely. When we go back into part two, we're back into kind of like that more lighthearted, playful, joking, kind of Scream-esque teen horror comedy kind of vibe. And I think that was a nice note to end because it allows most of the series to be lighthearted, to be that kind of teen comedy mood overall. And I think if we had stayed in 1666 and let that be the end of it, or let the end have gone into that kind of realm, then it would be very heavy. The one complaint that I will have is that the ultimate big bads and the final battles that they have in the part two don't feel nearly as big or as heavy as those moments that we got in 94, in 78, and even in 1666. They don't feel as big. And so that was a slight letdown for me. Couple of really good, cute moments though. I really like the vibe of the part two. You get kind of like an It Goonish kind of vibe where you've got like them setting traps for the big bad, things of that nature. I really like the character of Martin. Really adds to the comedic tone in part two, especially since we lost Simon, and Simon was really the one who was carrying over that comedic tone in part one. And so in that regard, I really like that character. It works as a standalone movie, but I do feel like you have to watch the entire trilogy or else the story is not going to make sense. You're not going to know why you're supposed to care about these characters, and you won't care about them. For example, it was really good to see Simon again. He was one of my favorite characters in part one. So to see him and Kate again in this, in reincarnated forms, or it's not really reincarnated, I guess it's deincarnated, like the reverse of that, was really nice. So I really enjoyed. I would give Fear Street 1666. I definitely would give it an A-. I think it does some things very well. And just enjoyable. You know, it's definitely not like the highest elevated echelon of horror. You know, I think there's definitely, you know, some stylistic choices that I really like that the director is doing that were really smart. And again, the overall tone and switching tones, the way that she's been able to in all three of these stories and really capturing each of these different genres of horror, really nice. I really enjoyed that. I will say what a lot of people I think are saying, that this was great as a trilogy and the 1 week drops were really nice. Shout out to Elliot over at Movie Files. I completely agree with you. I definitely think that Netflix should invest more in these weekly drops in the same way that MCU is doing over on Disney Plus. I think it allows that fan base to have moments of being able to really generate conversation around the work and really generate those theories and really be invested in it. And I definitely think that they should do something like this for Stranger Things. So it wasn't my favorite. I definitely would, for me personally, I like 1, 3, and then 2. But I think it's one of those things that it's just going to be a personal preference. Like I said in my part 2 video, if you really enjoy Friday the 13th and that kind of slasher genre, you're probably going to like part 2 better than part 1. And if you preferred something like a Scream, you're going to enjoy part 1 more than part 2. I think it's just going to be a personal preference thing, but I think the director really did a decent job overall. Some storytelling moments, you know, little minor things here and there, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But other than that, great job overall. Definitely recommend you watching the Fear Street trilogy. And this is where, if you haven't seen it, I would definitely come back later because I'm just going to take a few moments to talk about some thoughts overall, but I'm going to do deeper spoilers than probably I accidentally let slip right now. So come back later and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Don't forget to hit a subscribe and like if you've enjoyed this video so far. But let's talk about some of those spoilers. First and foremost, like I said, the turn onto Fear Street and like making the connection between Sarah Fier and Fear Street. I don't know why I was so slow. I really enjoyed seeing that on the screen and paying attention to that the third time. Was like, oh my gosh, I missed that. Likewise, how Dina kind of survives in part 2 of the 1666 movie by taping the Fear Street books to her chest and making kind of like a bulletproof or knife-proof vest. I loved that. I laughed out loud. That was a great moment. Seeing the Super Soakers, such a 90s kind of thing to do, really reminded me of like Home Alone. Martin was the best addition to this. Again, I wasn't that invested in Jillian Jacobs' performance as Ziggy, as adult Ziggy. So much of Ziggy and Sadie Sink really kind of like embodied Ziggy, and I didn't feel like there was that same attachment. I didn't feel like I was looking at the same person. And so in that regard, I could have done without Sadie Sink's adult counterpart. Sad to say, I didn't feel much for her. Likewise, I think if there maybe had been a moment with her and Sheriff Good, a little bit more than what there was, maybe that would have brought back some more investment for me. Like really seeing like her be distraught over what happened, I think that would have made it a little bit more of a payoff. The cutscene, I have tons of theories as to who might have taken the book, but I kind of hope that this does spawn kind of maybe an anthology, like American Horror Story kind of esque anthology. And I hope in that regard we don't find out who has the book until the end of that. I think that would be a great way, and maybe finding out that within that book they're able to create multiple different things that happen, and it's happening to more than one person. I think that would be a really interesting way to take this, because this definitely is, I feel like, the beginning of a Fear Street universe that I'm really excited about. I'm going to be reviewing American Horror Stories, which is kind of, to me, anyway, the way I'm reading it, is like a teen version of American Horror Story, a little bit more lighthearted. But this does that much better from what I've seen in the first 2 episodes of American Horror Stories. I'll be dropping that review soon. Overall, I really enjoyed this series. I'm trying to think of any major things that I haven't talked about. There was one moment, I think this goes to like why I'm not 100% on board with the choice to use the actors from part 1 and part 2 in the 1666 part 1 version. And there was a moment where Kate refers to Abby, who is Cindy, as like a whore, and at the end they're friends. And so I guess that goes to like making sure that the connections, and they have no connection, right? They're from 2 different generations, but at the end it seems like they're all friends with Sarah. And so that was kind of like a weird thing for her to say, and then for Sarah not to really come back hard and say, hey, don't call my friend a whore, or something like that. It was kind of weird. But I really like the idea of like them burying her. There's so much thematically that I think can be talked about in what Leigh Janiak was doing in this series that I haven't had a chance to speak on. There's a speech that Solomon gives in this one about identity, and he's not wrong. He's wrong for what he's doing, but he's not wrong in that Sarah was always going to be hated by this society. They were never going to accept her. Like in many ways, she was going to always end up on the end of that rope. And especially because, you know, she is a lesbian, and think about the time period. It just so happens that we're adding in, you know, him setting demons basically up, you know, and planting evidence and making it seem like it's her, but it was going to always kind of happen. And so I think there's a lot to be said about, there's a demonic presence, but again and again and again, I think the real killer in the story is the people, the community, especially Sunnyvale, pitting themselves against the Shadysiders. And it's the way in which we as our society pits the haves against the have-nots, and you know, it's kind of like a eat the rich type, you know, that's the only way to even it out, because it's going to always be the rich exploiting the poor. And there's a big conversation, I think, that's going on in the story about that. Again, I go back to the relationship between Dina and Josh, and also Sarah and Henry. I just wish that there was more investment in those sibling relationships, because I felt like they were so important to the characters' development, and yet we saw so little of it time and time again, and that really, really bothered me. We spent so much time with Sarah and Solomon, and so very little time with Sarah and Henry. There's also a big thing in here with like parental neglect. And I feel like that's a running kind of trope in teen horror anyway, is that the parents neglecting the kids, and that's how the kids are dying. And to see the adults in 1666 so heavily, where we don't really see that many adults in any of the other versions in the first two films, was a little interesting. So, you know, I get it. It was kind of like necessary to tell this story. But it's interesting to see how that, you know, Dina gives that speech to Hannah about like what, you know, a mother could to allow her daughter to be strung up and everything like that. Like the parents are basically allowing these kids to raise themselves, and look at what's happening. So there's just a lot of little touches that I do like. A lot that's going on in this series that I can't wait to see more of. I really do hope that they are able to turn this into a TV show. So what were some of your favorite moments from the Fear Street trilogy? Let me know down below in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next video. Toodles!